College football's first game ended at 3:30 p.m. And that also concluded the first top 10 upset of the season. Not that Florida State, at least at the current moment, is a top 10 team, but down they went in Dublin, Ireland. And what was really fascinating watching the whole game was just the fact that things that I talked about in my preview of this game came true, but at the same time, other things that I talked about were exposed to be complete baloney. And that's the beauty of this sport, is how some things can be so obvious that they're true and other things are so obvious that it's like it's too easy to talk about. It's too good to be true. There were things on Saturday, yesterday, that were from outer space. Even from someone like me who mentioned in August that Georgia Tech was a legitimate sleeper team who, if everything went right for them, I didn't know if they could make the college football playoff, but they could be one of those 2022 TCU type teams that just comes out of nowhere. Well, they didn't exactly come out of nowhere because some people picked them to win this game. Many, including myself, picked them to cover. But we'll dive deep into that, which was a disaster for Mike Norvell and Florida State, but certainly not the end of their season, and a huge win, the 5th ranked win for Brett Key and Georgia Tech. We're also going to talk about how wide open the ACC is. Now, I think many people, a little bit of myself included, expected this, but I thought that Florida State, by ashamedly so, a fair margin, was the best team in the conference, even better than Notre Dame, who is pretty darn good, and better than Miami, who theoretically is pretty damn good. But I think the upset that took place in Aviva Stadium makes it even more abundantly clear that the ACC is wide open. And then SMU's garbage performance against Nevada, but a good win for Preston Stone and RJ Maryland and Rhett Lashley and company to come out with a close win. Hopefully they learned some lessons there. Tells me that, yeah, the ACC is not only earned the name, the All Cupcake Conference, for a reason. They did not look good as a collective unit with 3 teams playing on Saturday, but also it's wide open for the taking. So for a college football season and for a fan base of college football that loves chaos and loves the underdog, the ACC will be a fun conference to watch in that regard. We also want to talk about Michigan's notice of allegations that the NCAA's notice of allegations that Michigan received today. Nearly got my tongue twisted there. And also, speaking of all the chaos that occurred and the fact that I said that Florida State's season is not over yet, I want to talk about teams that I think are still locks or close to locks to reach the college football playoff, depending on circumstances, if they lose 2 games. So we'll have to see. Of course, the SEC and the Big Ten would dominate that, but I think there are even a few ACC or Big 12 teams that, depending on how the season goes, depending on how they play their cards, or depending on whether they make their conference championship games and whether their second loss is in that conference championship game, maybe they will still have a strong likelihood of getting in. But before we dive deep into that, I want to encourage you all to do the obvious. I want you to like this video, to share it around, because we want to grow Touchdown Talk and grow college football with Sam. We're trying to hit 20,000 subscribers and also get our first video ever that has received 1,000 likes. And we'll be doing a giveaway for each of those achievements when, not if, they are reached. And I want you to be a part of that. So again, like the video, subscribe to the channel, click that notification bell so that you can get notified when we go live Sunday, Monday, Tuesday, and Wednesday at 8 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. That's 7 p.m. Central Time, 6 p.m. Mountain and Pacific Time, etc. If you're anywhere else in the world, I can't exactly help you, but you'll figure it out on your own, as humans are very smart and capable. And videos, whether they are from the live show or whether they are videos made as bonus content, where I'll be doing a lot of deep dive stuff for some games that I really want to focus on, or covering other topics I don't have the time to cram into these shows, those will be happening daily. So hitting that notification bell and subscribing is so important. Follow us on X and check out my Patreon page. On X, it's at College Football with Sam, at CFB with Sam, CFBW Sam. And for Patreon, it's the same thing, patreon.com/CFBW Sam. But let's dive right in. And we first and foremost obviously have to talk about the elephant in the room. And that is Florida State, but also Georgia Tech, because I think both of these teams surprised in a way that the college football world as a collective didn't expect, and that I certainly didn't expect. And that was the fact that Florida State looked anemic. They looked sick. They did not look well. And it's only game one. The season is not over. But the portal additions did not pan out the way the staff wanted them to. And you know that it's bad, or that there are issues going on, when DJ Uiagalelei, who is a above average good quarterback nationally, at a Power 4 level, he's probably average, above average, maybe good, but he's not great, he's not near elite, he's certainly not elite. Although he shows flashes of those characteristics, he's not consistent, and consistency is key, my friends. And what Georgia Tech and Brent Key were, no pun intended, they were consistent. Florida State was anything but consistent. As the Cover 3 podcast said, it didn't look like they were that comfortable in their identity. Not one bit. And whether it was them trying to run the ball, trying to create speed and space for their receivers out of the backfield, or their running backs on quick passes, easy throws to ease DJ Uiagalelei into the offense, or obviously defensively, it didn't work. It didn't work one bit. Tech stunned Florida State. They mowed them. They physically pounded them. And while I think that Florida State, in watching this game and seeing the talent they have and the coaches they have, is probably the better team in a power ranking standpoint, Florida State probably faces up against the average, above average, or even good Power 4 team, maybe better than Georgia Tech does, and maybe I'm wrong there. Georgia Tech had such a matchup advantage, and also such a physical toughness and good preparation to them. And that's a credit to Buster Faulkner, Tyler Santucci, and Brent Key, who I would all rate as good in their respective areas. I think Buster Faulkner is a good offensive coordinator. Santucci is a great defensive coordinator. And I think Key's a good head coach. They have a great staff, consequentially. When you have good assistants and good coordinators and a good head coach collectively, you have a great staff, because it's hard to have good at every position on the staff and also every position on the field. Georgia Tech's defense showed up. Their safeties were doing well on blitzes and in coverage. Their defensive ends and their defensive tackles and linebackers were challenging a Florida State offensive line where, make no mistake, they struggled. But they have NFL talent on that offensive line. And that offensive line, I think, is a good offensive line. I don't think it's as elite as I expected it to be in this game. But that first drive, Florida State punished Georgia Tech. But I think Georgia Tech adjusted, and they adjusted quickly, rapidly. I don't think Florida State did that until the end of the game, when you saw DJ Uiagalelei complete some good downfield throws on the fourth downs, and you saw those plays schemed up well. But remember, before those fourth downs, Florida State was running on 3rd and long and 3rd and medium, and they couldn't run the ball. Florida State only ran for 98 yards on 3.2 yards per carry. They had a 10-yard Roydell Williams run, a 10-yard Jalen Lucas run, a 28-yard Lawrence Toffili run. All of those were on the first drive, which ended in 8 points, a touchdown, and then a 2-point conversion. You take away those 48 yards away, which were gained on 3 plays. That right there is 50 yards. 50 yards on 28 rushing attempts. Now, what's 50 divided by 28, may you ask? Florida State, outside of those 3 carries, ran for 1.8 yards per carry. Now, imagine what Florida State's rushing offense would have done against, I don't know, Georgia, Alabama, even Texas with what they've lost on the defensive line, even Michigan and Penn State with what they've lost on the defensive line, Iowa, Ohio State. Think about Miami with their portal additions and what they return in Ruben Bain, or Clemson with the talent they have there. It was, for running the ball being, in my mind in the preseason, Florida State's obvious strength with what the O-line returned and with what they had at tight end. That was embarrassing. I mean, Florida State still averaged with DJ 7.1 yards per pass attempt, which ain't good, but it isn't bad either. And I thought DJ Uiagalelei was not even the 4th or 5th critical problem for Florida State in Ireland. And that's concerning given the fact that he's a limited quarterback. He is. Florida State, they were favored by 10.5 points. Georgia Tech beat them 24-21. They covered the 10.5 point spread. And Tech ran for 190 yards for 5.3 yards per carry and 3 touchdowns. And that doesn't even tell the full story because of the 2 fumbles, one by Haynes King, which was totally his fault, and another in which, I don't know if it was wholly his fault, but it was partially on him too. He nearly fumbled the ball away, and that would have taken it to overtime. Another fumble could have cost Georgia Tech the game straight up. I mean, Georgia Tech did not play a perfect game. It was a great game, but far from perfect. The biggest takeaway here is that Florida State's offense is disheveled. It's disorganized. It is not coached to the highest level that it can be. More importantly, because coaching is in developing individual talent and work ethic and speed and athleticism and toughness. That is different because that's more assistant coaching, like wide receivers coach, O-line coach, strength and conditioning. That's different from Mike Norvell and play calling. Also keep in mind the fact that Alex Atkins wasn't there. Now, that may not cause much of an impact, but it also could have explained the offensive line not playing as well as it did. Atkins being the offensive coordinator, but with Norvell calling the plays, he's more so the offensive line coach with a promotional tag, from my basic understanding. If I'm wrong, correct me in the live chat or the comments below. And speaking of the live chat, we'll be answering super chats at the end of the stream, as customary. But him being there may have impacted the O-line, by the way. So until he returns, which is after the Memphis game, it's in game 4, I would hold off a little bit on the offensive line, unless they very much struggle against Boston College and Memphis. But even then, not having your O-line coach or not having a position coach for any part of your roster can be a big deal. But more importantly than that was the fact that Florida State, they're running on 3rd and long when they can't run to save their lives. They're trying the same concept, pass out of the backfield, as if Georgia Tech hasn't tackled well all day long. They're trying downfield shots with DJ Uiagalelei when they have unproven wide receivers, when Tech is sending blitzes and pressure, and I don't think it was a well-schemed game for Florida State. Their preparation coming into the game may have been good, and it worked to perfection that first drive, but that was it. And we're just talking about the offense. We'll get into the defense in a few minutes. Florida State had 20 first downs. They were 5 of 12 on 3rd down. They were 2 of 3 on 4th down. That first 4th down, the only one that was missed in the game, I honestly thought that Florida State right there should have just kicked the field goal. And I'll tell you why. Because they were up by a point, 8-7. With that 2-point conversion gave them some juice. Georgia Tech decided not to try and play the 2-point conversion game and just wait until later. A field goal there, not only in hindsight, obviously makes it so that Georgia Tech is playing to get a game a game-tying field goal at the end, it also puts you up by 4 points. So Georgia Tech, they can't tie the game. They take the lead, and in taking the lead, they only go up by 3. So then Florida State, they kick another field goal, tie it by 14, and they can go up 17-14 in the half. And of course, in hindsight, brings the game to overtime, where I think just due to toughness and red zone efficiency, Georgia Tech wins in overtime anyway. But it's another shot, especially given that Florida State was adjusting, albeit slowly, at the end with some of those throws and being more willing to rely on DJ Uiagalelei because you had to. And while he wasn't perfect, he did step up, in my opinion, in the moments where he needed to. But that's really that for Florida State's offense. They only gained around 5 yards per play, and they only scored 21 points. They didn't even cross 300 yards on a Georgia Tech defense that allowed over 200 rushing yards last season, and a Georgia Tech defense that allowed around 450 yards total. A pretty awful performance by Florida State's offense. But, and I say this with a big but, it's not like the defense was that much better either. Their defensive line in particular, linebackers, really their front all around, disappointed. And thank you, SFS Inverted, for the $5 super chat. I'll get to that at the end. Just wanted to shout you out there. The defensive line, think about it this way. Florida State brings back Patrick Payton, who's an NFL defensive end. They return a plethora of talent there, not just in Patrick Payton, but also in Joshua Farmer, Darrell Jackson Jr. They brought in Marvin Jones Jr., a 5-star recruit who spent time at Georgia. And Mike Norvell praised this defensive line like he did the offensive line. The trench play was praised. I bought into the fact that Florida State could have the best trench play, perhaps, in the country. I predicted it to certainly be up there with the elites, up there with Georgia, up there with Michigan, up there with Ohio State and Alabama and Iowa and these other teams that I think will have, at minimum, above average offensive and defensive lines, and one of those being elite. That wasn't there. The elite trench play on either side of the ball, but I think especially the defensive line wasn't there. And DJ Lundy and Cam Riley at linebacker, the linebacker core was the only unit to register more than 1 tackle for loss. The defensive line had a half tackle for loss. The other 2.5 were to the linebackers. Florida State had no sacks. They only had 1 pass defended. And they did not tackle well. They had missed opportunities with tackles. I mean, think of the pass to Eric Singleton Jr., the screen pass from Haynes King. Didn't tackle that well. And it got Aiden Burr in range to kick a game-winning field goal when he missed one earlier. I mean, if you want to talk about the what-ifs for Florida State, and maybe they call the game a little differently, Georgia Tech had a field goal that didn't go their way. They had a face mask penalty on a brilliant play design by Tyler Santucci and a brilliant play up until the penalty by incoming transfer Romello Height, where they got DJ. And then face mask because of the positioning of Uiagalelei and the lack of discipline in that moment by Height, and it extended Florida State's drive. But the defense overall was just, it was pitiful to watch, and I'll tell you why it was pitiful, why it was depressing and an embarrassment. Georgia Tech went on 3 drives where they chewed 6 minutes of clock. Georgia Tech, in the final 20 minutes, this is a stat by Josh Pate, in the final 20 minutes of the game, only had 1 drive. Now, to their credit, it was a drive of 8 minutes and 24 seconds of 2 brilliantly designed 4th down conversions that only would have been 4th down conversions unless you change the play. Great throws by DJ Uiagalelei, great catches by his receivers, and great scheming by Mike Norvell. But Florida State's defense could not keep Georgia Tech's offense off the field, and Florida State led in TOP. They had 30 minutes and 39 seconds of possession. But Georgia Tech was able to drive on Florida State, and they were able to run the ball. There was at one point a drive, I forget exactly what it was. It may have been the second touchdown drive where not Florida State, but Georgia Tech, they ran the ball. Haynes King constantly got outside leverage over Florida State's secondary players, linebackers, and defensive ends. He had a good game, constantly gaining outside leverage, and it wasn't enough in the end. It wasn't enough for Florida State to do whatever they had to do on defense. But Haynes King had a good game. Jamal Haynes had a good game at running back. Eric Singleton had a good game at wide receiver. Georgia Tech's wide receivers stepped up all around, like Malik Rutherford. I think a former walk-on, and Chad Alexander at running back stepped up and had over 40 yards rushing for Georgia Tech. But Florida State's defense was the antithesis of that. They did not step up one bit. They had 0 sacks, 3 tackles for loss, and they allowed Georgia Tech to run for over 5 yards per carry. At one point, Georgia Tech was running for close to 7 yards per carry, and they only had 8 passing attempts. That is how badly Georgia Tech mowed Florida State's defense. But I also want to talk about Georgia Tech here and not just talk about Florida State and criticize them, and they rightfully should be criticized, but I want to talk about the winners. And on Touchdown Talk and on College Football with Sam, I like to deliver the winners last. You save the best for last. You squeeze out the pus first, and then when the person who has that horrific injury, after they're done screaming, you tell them after that what a good job they're doing. You don't tell them what a good job they're doing as their wound is just infected and you're about to painfully get all that stuff out. Speaking from personal experience because, well, maybe too much information, but I had an infected toe yesterday and it had to be cleaned out and it was very painful. But after that was the good news that my toe and consequently myself felt much better. Georgia Tech, the good news about all of this, about yesterday, is the fact that there is a team, America's team, an underdog in Georgia Tech, who is physical, who is tough, who has made improvements from last season, who is top 50 in the country in returning production, and they utilized it well, who is strong in their identity, that is in running the ball, who, most importantly, Haynes King looks to be improved, more secure with the football, more wise in his decision-making. He did not throw a single pass that could have been intercepted. And Georgia Tech's defense, they earned a sack. They had 7 tackles for loss. They got 63 tackles. They had 1 pass defended. And they held Florida State to, outside of those 3 plays of 10 yards or more, running for under 2 yards per carry. They held Florida State to running for under 4 yards per carry, and they held DJ Uiagalelei to completing just around 2 out of every 3 of his passes, and Florida State's receivers only averaged 10.2 yards per reception. And Florida State, keep in mind, they had no receiving touchdowns. None. No passing touchdowns, no receiving touchdowns. They had 2 rushing touchdowns, 2 of them. One was the long Lawrence Toafili run. The other was a shorter run by Roydell Williams, set up, of course, by the 2 fourth-down conversions. Georgia Tech's improved everywhere. I think the strength and conditioning and the coaching and all of it through year 2 of Brent Key's official staff has worked wonders. I think the hiring of Tyler Santucci has already paid off and will pay off as the year goes along. I think that Buster Faulkner, learning from Todd Monken and blending that with his air raid background, has paid huge dividends. He worked with the quarterbacks at Georgia. So he had a hand with Stetson Bennett and the amazing growth of Bennett and the player he was and Georgia's success in the air in 21 and 22. And consequently, he also worked in that quarterback room with Carson Beck, who may be the best quarterback in the country this year. I mean, this staff for Georgia Tech is phenomenal. It's underrated. It may be one of the best in the ACC, and they are tough, physical, they are smart, wise, whatever adjectives, whatever descriptors you want to use that are positive, that have positive connotations. Georgia Tech is that. They outgained and they outscored Florida State. And not only that, they averaged more yards per play. They were the better offense and the better defense that day. The only thing Florida State had that was better was the special teams unit, with Ryan Fitzgerald kicking 2 field goals that were over 50 yards, a 59-yarder and a 52-yarder. Him and DJ carried Florida State. You cannot convince me otherwise. And maybe a little bit of Toffoli and that running back room, or maybe it was the offensive line and not the running backs. I think we'll have to wait and watch a few more Florida State games to determine that. But Georgia Tech was together. Uncle Lou said this in his reaction. Georgia Tech is a team. Florida State is a collection of players, I think, who have yet to gel. There are some team aspects of Florida State, and I think Florida State is well coached, though there were some questionable decisions, but I'm not going to let that one game discount Mike Norvell and the fact that every year at Florida State they have gotten better and have improved up until this season. But Georgia Tech is a team. They're confident. They're tough. Florida State has some lessons to learn, and they could learn many things from this game against Georgia Tech. So keep on the lookout for both of these teams, for Florida State to see if they'll rebound, because with the transfers they brought in, I think it's likely they'll get better as the year goes on. And with Georgia Tech, with the experience they've returned and how confident they are in their identity, they could get better as the year goes on, especially working with a first-time defensive coordinator who's working with a team who was outside the top 100 in most defensive categories last year. They do have tough schedules compared to the average ACC school ahead, so we'll have to see. But good luck to Georgia Tech, to Florida State, and it's a huge win for Brent Key and company. Speaking of all of this, I think that Clemson benefits from this chaos. They benefit from this game, and so does another team that we'll talk about here. But Clemson, how do they win the ACC? They're currently first in odds to win the ACC championship game, and no doubt do they benefit from this chaos because Florida State was the odds-on favorite before kickoff to win the ACC. Now, they've fallen down behind Clemson and, you guessed it, Miami, and they would be well behind Notre Dame, too, if Notre Dame was an ACC member. So you look here at the ACC, and I will tell you, I have been someone who's been low on Clemson this whole time, and rightfully so. When you go 4-4 in the ACC with a top 5 talent roster, there are questions. I mean, I think Dabo Swinney for a while has been on his Mark D'Antonio the later years at Florida State. I think he's been on that type of run these previous few seasons, really ever since 2020. And Trevor Lawrence and Travis Etienne and good defense and Brent Venables carried him in 2020. Venables tried to carry him in 2021, then left for Oklahoma. And I think, honestly, Clemson's gotten worse every single season since 2018. They were worse in 19, worse in 20. While the 22 team won the ACC, I do think that the 21 Clemson team played a tougher schedule at the end of the day and end of the season, was more impressive. I think they were better than the 22 Clemson team, and 23 was just a disaster, bottom of the barrel. But Garrett Riley is in his second year, and elite coaches like Garrett Riley do big things in year 2. Matt Luke was hired as the offensive line coach. He gets to work with a plethora of returning starters, particularly, I think, 2 great offensive tackles in Blake Miller and Tristan Lay, and also a guard in Marcus Tate, and a few other offensive linemen who could be good and probably will be good with the development that they're receiving. They return enough on the defensive line with Peyton Page, and obviously with star Peter Woods, who's moved to defensive end. Barrett Carter comes back, Avion Terrell. I mean, they have players. And they haven't used the portal, but they have enough talent to where the portal and Dabo's refusal to use it is not going to kill them like it would, obviously Indiana, for example. It won't kill Clemson. It'll hamper them, but it won't kill them. I think Clemson should expect to be at the top, and they probably won't be at the top, at least every year or most years if they don't use the portal. But Clemson returns a lot of production, a lot of starters. I think they've made critical coaching staff upgrades, particularly in the trenches. And even with a loss to Georgia, I think Georgia's the best team in football. And as of now, I think it's their year to lose the national title. I think they're the best team in the nation by a significant margin. So a loss to Georgia doesn't define the season. I think what defines the season for Clemson is, what do you do in a likely loss? If they win it, then I don't even think that shows that Georgia's overrated. I just think that shows Clemson's one of the best teams in the country right out of the gate. But if they compete with Georgia for a half or 3 quarters and they look good in the trenches, and it's more so because of Georgia's skill position talent and depth rather than their outright superior toughness, and that's why Georgia pulls away, that's encouraging. Depending on how Clemson handles, games against Appalachian State, because they're a tough team who's played, Michigan, Texas A&M, other teams down to the wire, North Carolina for 2 years in a row. A game against NC State is big. And if the trenches leading up to that game against Florida State are dominant, and that is where Clemson's identity is, and they're able to run the ball with Maffa and whoever backs him up, and Klubnik looks better, and the receivers, especially the young talented ones, come through, they can win the ACC. Don't kid yourself. At this point, after watching Florida State, who I kind of foolishly, in hindsight, thought would have the best defense in the conference, I would say Clemson is going to have the best defense in the ACC right now. And with an offense that I think is bound to take steps forward, who knows? I mean, Clemson just 2 years ago won the ACC with DJ Uiagalelei at quarterback, and a defense that was one of the worst of Clemson's history over the past decade, because they've had some pretty elite defenses dating all the way back to the start of the college football playoff era in 2014. So I think Clemson absolutely can win the ACC. How they would do it, I think, is dominance in the trenches, because I don't think they have the quarterback and the wide receivers and the tight ends, and I'd say even the running backs. They don't have the skill position players, period, to win the ACC, certainly to win a college football playoff game if their trenches aren't dominant. But their trenches can be dominant. And I think that tackle duo, I think the entire offense, the entire offensive line perhaps, the defensive line, linebackers, DBs, the defense for sure, is going to be one of the best in the ACC. The defense will be one of the best in the country for sure, based off of how they recruit and coach there. They're currently first in odds to win the ACC championship. Vegas was wrong yesterday with the Georgia Tech Florida State game. But Vegas, they can't be wrong all the time, because, well, if they are, they don't make any money. So I think there's something to Florida State being first in odds here, perhaps. And there's certainly something to them winning the ACC, because just based off of what we watched yesterday, and assuming that that's somewhat consistent with Florida State's season for the remaining 11 games, of course they could rebound. There could be an act of God, and they could have the best trench play in the nation by the end of the year. I think they have that talent, but it's unlikely. If Clemson is who I think they can be and probably will be in the trenches this year, even on the road in Doak Campbell, they could very well win, and maybe should be favored and should be picked to win and should be expected to win. I think they should be expected to win by their fan base regardless, but being expected to win by a proud fan base and program internally versus the whole college football world is a different story. And I think that the narrative, too, about the portal nationally could flip as well, given Florida State, and also depending on how Colorado and Ole Miss and some of these other teams who've used the portal heavily do. Heck, even Ohio State with what they've brought in the portal with Seth McLaughlin, a player who the jury's out on him based off how he did last season, and also combine that with the high ceiling he showed in 2022 and 2021. We'll just have to wait and see. But while the portal is useful, and while I don't think my personal opinion on the portal and its usage will be changed if Clemson beats Florida State, the mood for Florida State or Clemson, the ACC, and perhaps part of the college football world could be changed. That game right there still has big implications because Clemson will likely be better than Georgia Tech and will be the toughest team that Florida State plays until at Miami in week 9. And for Clemson outside of Georgia, maybe NC State, but NC State's at home. It'll probably be after Georgia the toughest game for Clemson until on the road at Virginia Tech. And Florida State could still very well be better than Virginia Tech and be the second best opponent on Clemson's schedule the whole year through. So I think Clemson can win the ACC. And I think it's much more likely, now that Florida State looks vulnerable, the fact that Clemson doesn't have to play a team like Georgia Tech, who's physical and could be one of the best teams in the ACC. I know that's a bold opinion, but I said they were a sleeper in the preseason. They did even more than I expected them to do in week 0 in Ireland. So they should be in that conversation, I think, with the performance they put on. How Florida State wins the ACC is trench play, is toughness, and it's just improvement at wide receiver and quarterback and health at running back to the point where the skill position play overall is not just bad or below average or average, it's above average, good, maybe at the very best great. And combined with the trenches that Clemson has on defense, what they should have on offense with Matt Luke and all that they return, and also the tight end bringing stool, that's how they'll win the ACC, is by being physical, not just on up front on defense, but also on the offensive line. The ACC period is wide open. And I wanted to start off with Clemson because they're first in odds. We'll get to Miami here in a few seconds. But I think the conference is wide open. So tell me down below, who do you think is going to win? Who do you think is going to win the ACC? You got Clemson, you got Miami, you got Florida State, you have Georgia Tech. I mean, look, SMU looked terrible yesterday against Nevada. They put on a garbage performance. Preston Stone was benched and still passed for nearly 300 yards because Nevada isn't that good. But Nevada scored 24 points on SMU, who I think profiled to have a defense that should have performed better than this. And they only scored 29 points. And at one point, Nevada was given over an 80% chance to win starting in the fourth quarter per FPI. Preston Stone went 17 of 30 for 254 yards, a touchdown, a pick, had a QBR of 61.6. And a lot of those yards came from a bomb to RJ Maryland in the fourth quarter. But can SMU win it? They have an easy schedule. Miami has an easy schedule, plus Damian Martinez, Cam Ward. Damian Martinez, a 1,000-yard rusher. Brought in Samuel Brown from Houston. Brought back Xavier Restrepo and Jacoby George. They have several offensive linemen who are NFL caliber. They brought in Simeon Barrow on the defensive line, brought back Reuben Bain Jr. there as well, who was fantastic as a young defensive end. This conference is wide open. And I think that there are so many teams. I mean, heck, Virginia Tech, with what they've done, bringing in and returning, Aeneas Peebles, bringing him in from Duke, returning Antoine Powell-Ryland. On the offensive line, Parker Clements returns, Braylon Moore and Caden Moore, and Kyron Drones and Bashal Tutin are also great skill players at quarterback and running back, respectively. And maybe I'm missing a team. Maybe Syracuse with Kyle McCord does something. Or maybe NC State with Grayson McCall and Robert Anae, who's a great offensive mind. And also Jordan Waters. They can do something for sure. And Kevin Concepcion. So let me know. Let me know who you think can win the ACC this season down in the comment section below. And again, we'll get to Super Chats at the end of the stream. Just stick around. I want to get into Miami and talk about them. We talked about Clemson previously and how they can win the ACC. I now want to talk to you about Miami and how Miami can win the ACC. They're currently second in odds to win the ACC championship, and how Miami wins the ACC. And actually how, look, you want to talk about bold, how they are a national championship contender is they're just well coached. And more than well coached, more than well trained, they are put in a position to win by their CEO, Mario Cristobal. That's why. That's exactly why they'll win the ACC if they do, and how they'll win the ACC. Is that because they have the talent everywhere. The only place where Miami, Florida perhaps could be lacking is safety and corner. And they got Michelle Powell from Washington, and they have Daryl Porter Jr. as well at corner. And they have some other players, brought in some transfers. They have talent there. And their defensive end room, their edge unit might be one of the deepest in the country. I think it's the deepest in the ACC by a mile. Francisco Mauigoa and Jalen Alderman are good linebackers. On the offensive line, Jalen Rivers and Francis Mauigoa probably make up the best offensive tackle duo in the ACC. Samson Okunlola, Inez Cooper, Zach Carpenter make up the interior of that line. And as I've already said, Cameron Ward, Damian Martinez, and even Martinez's backup Mark Fletcher Jr. and A.J. Allen make up a deep running back room. And I think that Shannon Dawson will have one of the best offenses in the country. The defense should be good, should be better than last year. Miami should get better in basically every facet of their game compared to last year. They have questions, for sure. Cameron Ward, how consistent is he? How physical can this team be? How tough can they be when they get in a down spot, like against North Carolina last year or Georgia Tech, where they floundered? Can the skill positions improve from last year? Can they be healthy at tight end? Can the defense, put up a stop against a good offense? We'll just have to see. They have areas to improve upon, no doubt about it. But you look overall, and just if they're schemed well, if the right plays are called on an average basis, because no one's a perfect play caller outside of maybe Phil Parker at Iowa, if things just come together, really if things are by how they say on the recruiting board and the transfer portal board, if things go how they should go based off of the player profiles, the talent, the profiles of the incoming transfers who haven't been coached by Miami before the season, then Miami should win the ACC, perhaps win a playoff game or compete for it all. But that's never how things go, because you have to factor in game management. You have to factor in the fact that Miami hasn't recruited at an elite level for 4 or 5 cycles. They haven't yet. They're still building their program. They're not where they want to or need to be to compete for it all, to bring the U back. They're not there yet. I mean, Clemson still has a more talented roster. Florida State, who hasn't recruited nearly as well as Miami, has a talent roster that's comparable to Miami in a variety of ways. I think, in fact, according to 24/7 Sports Team Talent Composite, I think they're actually ahead of Miami by 1 spot. And ironically, they're behind Florida by 1 spot. Florida's another example of a school who has a lot of talent, but very poor coaching, very disheveled, and consequently, they aren't that good. For Miami, they have an easier schedule. Their assistants, and I think strength and conditioning coach, particularly with Aaron Feld, are better than what Florida has there. But Cristobal has had hiccups, and not just at Miami in 23 or 22, but also Oregon in 21, in 20, in 19, in 18. It is in him to mess up once per season. And until that's no longer the case, I just can't give that benefit of the doubt to Miami. I can't. To go undefeated and at least at this point to win it all, or perhaps to even win a playoff game. But can they win the ACC? Absolutely. I personally would favor them over Clemson, but that's just me. It's early. We have not even seen Miami or Clemson take the field, but we will in 5 or 6 days, depending on if you count today as a part of that, countdown. But if Miami wins the ACC, and how they'll win the ACC is everything comes together. And by that, because of how good the roster is and how good the assistants are and how I think, the scheme and the players, they all fit like a nice puzzle piece. The question is, does Mario Cristobal come along with a hammer and just smash that puzzle piece to bits? And if he doesn't, if he's a CEO, if he just is hands off of everything, then, and part of that's also on the assistants, because the only way that can totally be alleviated, the Cristobal effect, is if you have elite assistants. And I'm not talking about great, I'm talking about elite, like the best of the best. If they have the best of the best, or many who are the best of the best, and the players I already think have the talent to be at that level too, then that's how Miami won the ACC, because by my roster profile and by my research and by many others, they should have the best roster in the ACC. Even if you factored Notre Dame into this equation and, adjusted for recruiting and coaching and experience and, stats and how they've performed in the games, even if you had a Notre Dame who's like top 10 in talent now because Marcus Freeman's done a really good job of recruiting, and I think may even elevate Notre Dame past what Kelly had them at, which was pretty good, Miami might be the best, even factoring in Notre Dame, in terms of what they can be, in terms of their potential power. The question is, will it all come together? Will Cristobal change, or more likely, will he step away, recognize his limitations, and play to his strengths? That is how Miami wins the ACC. It's not just by being physical, not just by using the finesse that they have at the skill positions. It's also by when things get dirty, when things get down, and they inevitably will, because it happens to every team unless you're a GOAT team in the regular season. It even happened to LSU and Alabama in 19 and 20 respectively. When things get ugly, can they come through? And if they do, then if they're that type of team, then I'd say they're a lock to win the ACC. If they don't, they can still win it, but it will be a lot harder. And a team like Clemson, Florida State, even Georgia Tech, who Miami plays again, who are in general well coached, could, and one of them probably will, beat the Hurricanes. So I think Miami, the ball is in their park. It's in their park. It's in Clemson's park. And in fact, I'd even say it's still in Florida State's park. We'll just have to wait and see how the weeks play out. College football games, as Josh Pate says, are never played on paper. They're played on the field. But overall, what I want to talk about next, speaking of the chaos that has happened, that is transcribed in week 0, is who can make the college football playoff with 2 losses. And we'll do this alphabetically, which means we'll start with the ACC and end with the SEC, and we'll only talk about the Power 4, because no group of 5 team, unless they win their conference, is making it in with 2 losses. And even those who do, there is a chance that, well, they won't, because there are going to be 5 group of 5 conference champions. I expect many of them will have 2 losses. Some may even have more, because Boise State won the Mountain West last year with more than 2 losses. Fresno State, I believe in 2022, went 10-4, won the Mountain West with 4 losses to conclude the season. So we'll just talk about the Power 4. And where I want to start with is the ACC. And I add a question mark to the ACC, and I'll do the same thing with the Big 12, because I don't know if the ACC or the Big 12 can have a team, can field a team that will be a lock to get in, or close to a lock, if they suffer 2 losses. And that is the regular season, but even a second loss in a championship game. Because think about it this way. Miami's not up here, because I think they have a pretty easy schedule. Unless Florida turns out to be a team that goes bowling or has a winning record, more importantly, they won't be that respected by the end of the year. Because if they have a losing record again, Billy Napier's likely being fired. They will look ugly at the end of the year if that happens, if he's fired middle of the year, if they get demoralized. So the playoff committee won't care about a win over Florida. They will tell you that maybe they do, but they won't, unless Billy Napier pulls things together, utilizes the returning production, and it has a good year. Then they'll care about that. Miami, they avoid Clemson. They play Georgia Tech, which that Georgia Tech win bolsters their strength of schedule, but Florida State's loss weakens it. And they overall have a very easy path. So if they go 11-1 and lose in the conference championship, they lose the ACC. With an 11-2 record, they'd likely be in. So maybe I should have put them up here. But I think that in a strong year where you have multiple, and I mean like close to 10, like in 2023, teams that have one loss or are undefeated, and you factor in that only 11 of those 12 spots can be Power 4 teams because the Group of 5 gets an auto bid, I don't know if Miami would be a lock. I don't think they would. And non-conference scheduling is a big deal, at least it has been in the past. It's been a big deal to the playoff committee. And consequentially, that's why these teams that are up here from the ACC, plus Notre Dame, because Notre Dame has enough of a wild card schedule with teams like Georgia Tech and USC, and now Florida State. I mean, you could even include Louisville in here. They have enough teams on their schedule. And don't forget Texas A&M on the road, and A&M with a top 10 talent roster, and Mike Elko should be awesome this year. Notre Dame has enough teams on their schedule where some of them, at least 2, maybe 3, will finish the year ranked. So a 10-2 Notre Dame, I think unless it's a very strong year, could get in. And that is like factoring in that they won't play in a conference championship game, so they won't get that bonus. I mean, even a 12-0 Notre Dame could be lower than a 5 seed, depending on how strong the year is. But 10-2, if the schedule plays to their advantage, they could very well get in. Even with Miami, I don't see that happening unless their second loss is in the ACC championship game. If they go 10-2 in the regular season, due to tiebreakers, it would be unlikely with a weaker conference schedule that they'd even get in the ACC championship game. And I think consequentially, they'd be left out with an easier schedule. They'd be one of the first 4 out, which is funny because that's typically a term used for basketball. But now the playoff is more like March Madness. Florida State, I think, playing on the road at Notre Dame and also playing both Miami, Clemson, North Carolina, who has a good reputation. If Georgia Tech does well, this loss, especially since it's early, will not penalize them. And they play Florida in the non-conference, which, as I said, the committee won't care about unless they're good. So the Florida game won't harm them because they're a Power 4 team. It can only help them. It will either do nothing for Florida State or help them. And they also play Memphis in the non-conference, and Memphis will likely be a good Group of 5 team. Perhaps it's the best Group of 5 team. So I think a 10-2 Florida State, even if they miss the ACC championship game, a 10-2 Florida State, I think could sneak in. And I think it would be likely that they could get in because a loss to Georgia Tech and then Notre Dame, Miami, who are on the road, and Clemson at home remaining, if they go 10-2, they're beating Clemson, Miami, Notre Dame. They're beating 2 out of those 3 teams. And Miami and Notre Dame and Clemson could all be top 10 teams. Clemson could be unranked. Miami could also be unranked. I think Notre Dame is a lock to at least finish top 20 this year. Well, at 10-2, depending on how things play out, I think it's much more likely than a 10-2 regular season Miami or SMU to get in. You look at Clemson, and Clemson, just by virtue, I think, of playing Georgia in the non-conference, they get kind of insurance there. Like an 11-1 Clemson would probably be treated, especially if they win the ACC championship, but even if they lose it, if they win the ACC championship, they'd be treated like a 13-0 ACC champion because Georgia's just that good. And if they lose the ACC championship and to Georgia and are 11-2, I'd say they get in as well at 11-2 because you played Georgia and then would play and lose to, if X team Clemson plays wins it, the best team in the ACC. They'd be a lower seed. They wouldn't get a home playoff spot like an 11-2 Big Ten or SEC runner-up would, but they'd get a road opportunity to prove themselves. And also they play a road game at South Carolina. They play App State, who's a better Group of 5 team, and the South Carolina game doesn't harm them, but it can help them if Lenoris Sellers and South Carolina are good. And they play at Virginia Tech, at Florida State, and they host NC State. And they also play Louisville at home. So I think a Clemson team that goes 10-2 regular season would be likely to get in. They're a lock to get in if they reach the ACC championship game and only finish with 1 or 2 losses. And the other team to talk about, I think, is not Virginia Tech, but Georgia Tech. By beating Florida State, they're off to a 1-0 start. They'll probably beat Georgia State, and their next several games are winnable. But then they play Notre Dame in Week 8, at Virginia Tech in Week 9, Miami in Week 11, NC State Week 13, and at Georgia in Week 14. Georgia Tech is one of the toughest schedules in the country. Georgia Tech only losing 2 games, even if those 2 losses are like randomly to, at Virginia Tech and like at North Carolina, but they beat Notre Dame and beat Georgia, which I know it's impossible or close to impossible. But let's say that happens. They would still get in because they have so many quality opponents that they either beat all the teams that are great or worse but lose to the elite, or they beat an elite team, which is a huge resume boost. I mean, if Georgia Tech goes 9-3, and if it's a down year, they could get in. So they're up here, I think, for pretty obvious reasons. Up next, we have the Big 12. The Big 12 will be short. There aren't much teams to talk about. In fact, I'd even question if these 2 teams would get in with 2 losses on their schedule. It's the same with all the ACC teams, by the way, outside of, I would say, Georgia Tech. Georgia Tech with 2 losses is probably guaranteed to get in. I'd say same thing with Clemson. But with the Big 12, I put Iowa State up here because they have that non-conference road trip at Iowa, and they play at West Virginia, hosting UCF, at Kansas, at Utah, and they host Kansas State. Utah, Kansas State, Kansas, and Iowa are all ranked opponents, and West Virginia, UCF, and I would say that's probably it, but those 2 teams could be ranked. So there's enough teams that even if, tons of upsets happen to the opponents on their schedule who look good, they'll have enough ranked wins or opportunities to earn ranked wins to where Iowa State at 10-2 in the regular season, they could get in. I think it would actually be somewhat likely, depending on who the 2 losses were to. And if they reach the championship game, the Big 12 championship game, and they only have 2 losses after that, whether they win the Big 12 championship game or they lose it and that's their second loss, I think it'd be likely for them to get in. But more importantly, for Utah, with their reputation, they're starting off ranked high and being the Big 12 favorites, and the fact that they play Oklahoma State, Arizona, they play Iowa State at UCF, and really it's Kyle Whittingham, it's their reputation. A 10-2 Utah in a down year would get in. A Utah team who reaches the Big 12 championship game, win or loss, as long as they have fewer than 3 losses, I'd say that's probably a lock to get in. For example, my current projections, and these haven't changed because a Big 12 team didn't play yesterday, my current projections are Utah and Kansas both enter the Big 12 title game with an 11-1 record, and Utah beats Kansas, and Kansas is one of the first 4 teams out of the playoff with 11-2 because their schedule is very easy, and it's Kansas. But if Kansas were to beat Utah, Kansas gets the auto bid at 12-1, but I think Utah at 11-2 is enough of a name brand, good schedule, and they'll be a good enough team with the players they have to where I think they get in as a lower seed with an 11-2 record. Now we're getting into the real stuff, and I think what's more obvious is the Big Ten. There are several Big Ten teams who can make the college football playoff with 2 losses. I'm talking about Ohio State. I'm talking about Michigan, Oregon, Wisconsin, USC. I didn't put Penn State up here because I think Penn State is in a similar boat to like Florida State and not Miami, but like Florida State and Utah, where it's not a guarantee that they get in if they're 10-2 and don't make their conference championship game. It's likely. It's possible. History says it would be a guarantee, but since Penn State no longer plays Ohio State and Michigan every year, they play Ohio State this season but not Michigan, they have fewer opportunities to earn really quality losses, because that's what's kept Penn State in what would be a hypothetical 12-team playoff race if it was instituted in 2014, would be quality losses, because Penn State rarely earns quality wins. But what they do have is competitive games against top 10 teams. Well, there are likely going to be, unless USC is elite this year or near elite, or if Wisconsin's near elite or great, there will be one less opportunity for a quality loss. So that 10-2 will look uglier than it did last season. So that's why I don't have them up here, but it would still be possible. Ohio State, Michigan, Oregon, Wisconsin, and USC play 2 or more high quality, as in like top 10 opponents. They do. And Ohio State, in my mind, plays 3 teams that I have in my top 6. Michigan plays 3 teams I have in my top 8. Oregon plays 2 that I have in my top 4. And a game at Wisconsin where I think Wisconsin's a top 20 team. Wisconsin plays Alabama, Penn State, and Oregon, 3 teams in my top 6. And USC, they play Notre Dame, they play Penn State, they play Michigan. Those are 3 teams currently in my top 10. I updated my top 10, by the way. And that will showcase tomorrow, August 26th, also at 8 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, when I'll be going live again. I'll have updated college football playoff predictions, my top 25, and even my final conference predictions, of course, adjusting for Florida State's loss to Georgia Tech, among other things. And USC also plays Wisconsin, they play Rutgers, they play Nebraska, and LSU, all teams that I have ranked in my top 25. More than half of their schedule's made up, in my mind, of top 25 opponents. So USC at 10-2 absolutely gets in. At 9-3, USC's in the same boat with, I would say, Ohio State, even ahead of Michigan, to where USC or Ohio State at 9-3 with the schedules that I think they have, in a weak year, they'd get in. Same thing probably with Michigan. With Oregon and Wisconsin, I don't think they have enough. Wisconsin maybe with Alabama, Penn State, and Oregon, but I don't think they have the brand name that Michigan and Ohio State do, and they don't have the mass amount of ranked opponents on their schedule as a collective that USC does. I mean, USC plays 2 non-conference games that could feature top 10 opponents by the end of the season in LSU and in Notre Dame. It's crazy. So I think the Big Ten can field multiple teams that have 2 losses and will likely, if not are guaranteed, to reach the college football playoff. I think especially Ohio State fits this bill. In fact, I think a 10-2 Ohio State team, even in a strong year, and I think this would be the same with a 10-2 USC, because of their schedule or their dominance or whatever you want to call it, but let's just say their schedule because the dominance isn't guaranteed. A 10-2 USC and a 10-2 Ohio State probably get home playoff games as the 7th or 8th seed with a 10-2 record. That's how tough their schedules are. I think it would be the same thing with, let's say, Georgia or Alabama. There'd be a likelihood, not a guarantee, but a likelihood that along with Ohio State and USC, if they were to go 10-2, that Georgia and Alabama, if one of them were to go 10-2 in a strong year, could have a home playoff game. I also think that Texas A&M, Texas, LSU, and Oklahoma, if these teams have 2 losses, they will likely be in the college football playoff. It's so much easier to reach the playoff now with another 8 slots, 7 guaranteed slots for the Power 5, likely guarantee. Of course, theoretically, if there's like 2 strong group of 5 teams, you could get 2 in, but that's very theoretical. It's unlikely. Ole Miss and Missouri missed this list because Missouri's only preseason top 10 game is at Alabama, and Ole Miss's only preseason top 10 game is hosting Georgia. Of course, their schedules could be tougher, at which point they could get in. Same with many Big Ten teams who I didn't put up there, who, if their schedules are tougher, they could get in with 2 losses. But as I see it right now, if Ole Miss goes 10-2 and if Missouri go 10-2, if it's a very strong year, they'd be out with their schedules. That is a big if, though, if it's a strong year. I personally am of the opinion that you will see the vast majority of the 12-team playoff feature undefeated or 1-loss teams, but that's just my opinion, and I could be very wrong there because one of the teams that I had going undefeated was Mike Norvell's Florida State. Let's keep that on the down low. But I especially want to look at Oklahoma. I mean, Oklahoma is a team that, like USC or Michigan or Ohio State, could go 9-3. Also like Georgia and Alabama. And by could go 9-3, I mean they could make the playoff with a 9-3 record. I don't even think it's possible for Georgia to go 9-3. I don't even think it's possible for Ohio State to go 9-3, quite frankly. But if they did, they could make the playoff with that record because of how tough their schedule is. Look at Oklahoma. Their conference slate starts out with Tennessee, probably a ranked opponent. Auburn could be a ranked opponent. Texas, top 10. Then South Carolina. At Ole Miss, really good opponent. Maine, then at Missouri, phenomenal opponent. And then Alabama after the bye and at LSU. It's a schedule, ironically, very similar to Lincoln Riley's now current school in USC. You have 7, maybe more teams than that, but probably 7 or 6 that are going to be good football teams. I mean, an 8-4 Oklahoma could be better, in fact, vastly better, depending on how it plays out, than like a 10-2 or 11-1 Iowa. An 8-4 Oklahoma could be better than a 10-2 Penn State, for example, and could be better than a 10-2 Ole Miss or a 10-2 Missouri. It's a very tough schedule. What these new schedules do, particularly I think in the SEC, where there's just so much depth, is they create essentially a lottery. And like Ole Miss and Missouri, from a preseason angle, won the lottery. And I could argue to Tennessee to a certain degree. And I mean, in my mind, Tennessee's only insane games they have to play are at Georgia, hosting Alabama. Depending on how Oklahoma does this year, they could be very beatable. And then in the Big Ten, you have Rutgers, for example, and Iowa, and I think even Nebraska to a certain degree, who won the scheduling lottery and will be looked upon in hindsight as doing so, depending on how they play their cards. In the SEC and the Big Ten, much lesser degree the ACC and the Big 12, in the best 2 schools by a mile, or best 2 conferences by a mile in college football, you have a scheduling lottery where the majority of the schools get very tough schedules, but a few of them, and in this case, in this year, I think many of the good teams, the great teams, even some of the near elite teams, not the elite teams, but many of the teams just below that have very easy schedules. And that's why I think this will be a strong year in terms of end of season record. I think overall this will in fact be a weak year of college football because I think there's some lacking in terms of quarterback play outside of the SEC and many other things as well. But scheduling wise, end of regular season wins and losses wise, this will probably be a strong year in my mind because I think teams like Missouri and Ole Miss and Penn State and Rutgers and Iowa and I mean Tennessee could take advantage of their schedule, etc. These are all good, great, some of them near elite teams with perhaps elite potential who I think have won the scheduling lottery. So Georgia, Alabama, A&M, Texas, LSU, and Oklahoma are SEC teams who I think would be a lock or close to a lock to make the college football playoff with 2 losses. And finally, I want to close out the show by talking about Michigan receiving the NCAA's notice of allegations. Pete Thamel reported that these notice of allegations were very similar to the ones that were in the draft notice of allegations. Very similar to the notice draft that was leaked in early August. It's mostly unchanged. Mostly. So there could be extra penalties, but what I take away from this is the fact that I don't think the hammer will drop on Michigan. I've said that opinion previously, and people said, oh, well, you know, you don't want the hammer to drop. And well, full disclosure, I'm a Michigan fan, so I don't. But objectively, I don't think it will. If anything, my fan side says that it will happen because I always want to prepare for the worst. But objectively, where I don't have to prepare for the worst as a fan, I don't think it'll happen. I think the worst that will happen, the worst that could be in that notice of allegations, is some type of fine, scholarship reduction, maybe a postseason ban for like a year, maybe 2, or more likely than all of that is probably Sharon Moore, a suspension for him, or maybe even more likely than that, some type of severe fine or temporary scholarship reduction or a further reduction of recruiting visits, for example. I mean, I don't know what you want me to tell you guys. I'm not an insider. I'm not even close to who Pete Thamel is, and Pete Thamel doesn't even, he's not even telling us what these formal notice of allegations are. And Michigan has, 90 days to respond to this, and the NCAA has 30 days to respond to after that. So the season will almost be done by the time that all of this is formally settled. And in fact, I think what will probably happen is there will probably be something that happens this year, this season, just looking at this from an objective view. But I think a lot of this will come to fruition in the 2025 preseason. And the notice of allegations draft here, I'm gonna pull it up for you guys. NOA draft Michigan. I want to look at this. Again, this was written, the draft article by Dan Murphy and Pete Thamel on August 4th of 2024, so 3 weeks ago, exactly. The draft, which could be subject to change, stated that Sharon Moore could face a show cause penalty and possibly a suspension for allegedly deleting a thread of 52 text messages with former Michigan staffer Connor Stalions in October 2023, on the same day that media reports revealed Stalions was leading an effort to capture the play-calling signals of future opponents. The draft also states the text were later recovered via device imaging, and he was accused of a level 2 violation. Again, as I've stated before, based off of the fact that the texts were recovered and he only received a level 2 violation, I don't think much, if any, incriminating evidence was found in those text messages, because if there were any, Sharon Moore would have and should have been given a level 1, and he wasn't. Moore took over as the Wolverines head coach in January when Harbaugh left for the Chargers. What gets Moore in trouble is not the level 2 violation, it's not the deleted text messages, it's the fact that he's a repeat violator due to the fact that he contacted recruits during the COVID-19 dead period, also what Michigan fans call Burgergate. He's a repeat violator. That's really what gets Sharon Moore, and I would argue Michigan, in trouble, is him and the school are listed as repeat violators. The school has a level 1 violation as well. I'm trying to look for anything else that says what possible punishments Michigan could receive. I mean, Thamel said postseason ban is unlikely, vacation of wins is unlikely. What you will likely see is a fine, an attempt at a suspension of some type, whether that's for this year, whether that will be served out in 2025, a scholarship reduction. And this isn't me doing propaganda. This is just me speculating based off of what Thamel said in an interview, what he wrote in the article. That's my opinion. That's my interpretation of all of this. It's very, very unlikely that the hammer will drop. Don't expect it to. Now, the question of whether it should or should not, I'm just going to leave that up to you guys, because I think my thoughts to a certain degree have already been clear on this matter. But whether you want it to or not, or you think it will or won't, or you want it to happen and you think it's justified or you think it isn't, the probability that it will happen is just not likely. And if you're particularly, I would just say, if you're Ohio State and Ryan Day, who's really been the only team over the previous 3 years outside of Michigan State in 21 to even compete with Michigan, what you want to do is to beat Michigan. You want to beat them this year on the field. And Day and the team, whether how badly they were aggrieved or whether they were aggrieved at all, they have the tools to beat this Michigan team. They're favored to beat this Michigan team. I here am picking them as of right now to beat Michigan in Columbus. I am. And if there's going to be anything that stops Michigan, and I'm saying this because I think many people want the hammer to come down to stop Michigan, what will stop Michigan in all likelihood is not the NCAA. It'll probably be Ohio State or another elite team in the Big Ten this year. And if Michigan beats Ohio State and they beat Oregon and beat Texas and win the Big Ten again, or even win it all somehow, which is very unlikely, well, Connor Stalions is gone. He's controversially recruiting in a Detroit high school, and most of Michigan's staff from last year is gone because due to their cheating, they had to leave. They had to. They weren't going to stay safe in Ann Arbor. They won't. Michigan had to, they would have had to hand out a harsher punishment if Harbaugh and most of his staff stayed around. But they left. Michigan lost a lot of their players and roster. And now here we are. And I'm talking a little bit about on-the-field stuff instead of off-the-field stuff, which is what the NOA is, because I don't know, because let's just play football. Enough with the cheating scandal or the signs. Enough with all that talk. Michigan won the national title. They beat Penn State. They beat Ohio State. They did those two things with their head coach suspended, and he should have been suspended. They beat Alabama. They beat Washington, all without Stalions, all without any possible advantage over their opponents. They won those games fair and square. Before that, you can question it, and I'm not going to stop you because Michigan had some type of advantage. But to say that, all those, those wins are tainted, no. Not after he was suspended. The wins before then, absolutely. And maybe I'll give you to a degree that, the 2023 team as a whole even was, because it was caught then, and, the recruiting and stuff that happened because of Michigan's success. And I don't want to get too much into that because even I think that argument to a certain degree is bogus. But it just is what it is. Let's talk about football here. And let's talk about the fact that Michigan football is a team with a lot of unknowns. The unknowns are even factored into the part of, will Sharon Moore be suspended or not? What will the NOA contain? Will they punish Michigan this year or not? That's involved. But also you can talk about the fact that they have questions because Ohio State and Oregon, and I'd say even Penn State, return more production. And theoretically, with what they return and the fact they have coaching staff continuity and they made good hires or retain their good hires, they should, or at least Oregon and Ohio State should be better than Michigan this year. And heck, I'd even say Penn State, even with some of the questions that they have. So those are my thoughts on Michigan receiving the notice of allegations from the NCAA. The hammer isn't dropping. It's just not. Michigan will receive some type of punishment on top of what they've already received, and that's how it'll be. That's really it. And I think that the people who say that, the cheating never happened, I think that's a moronic take. I think the people who think that cheating was the only reason why Michigan succeeded, I think that's also a moronic take. I think both are coping. On one end, it's the coping of rival fan bases like I'd say Ohio State primarily, that wants to believe that Michigan could never beat the precious scarlet and gray. And on the other hand, for Michigan fans, it's the hypocrisy that the precious maize and blue could never cheat, could never be immoral. And it's just, I'm sick of it. I'm sick of it as a college football fan, an analyst who respects Michigan, who respects Ohio State, who can set my Michigan fan bias aside. Let's just play football, because as it looks like right now, from my angle and from the national angle in particular, Michigan's not the best team in the Big Ten. I think they're undervalued, but Ohio State is, and I think will, be better. Let's just let it play out. Let the NOA play out. Michigan will receive some type of punishment, guaranteed, unless they fight it and somehow win. And let's just let the regular season stuff play out. And what's done is done. That ultimately is my opinion. And thank you for watching episode 14 of Touchdown Talk. I'm going to get to these super chats, read them one by one, and then we'll get on out of here. Okay, so let me do this. Really good show today, guys. We had over 312 viewers. And this was our first college football Saturday of doing Touchdown Talk consistently. We have almost 40 concurrent viewers right now. This is incredible. I did I tried my best to work as hard as possible to make sure these graphics were quality. And yeah, I mean, I obviously was inspired by, myself, Joel Klatt, Josh Pate, many others. So thanks to them, too, for helping to inspire a show like this. But let's get into it right here and talk about these super chats. Can I display all of them? I hope that I can, but I don't think I can. I don't think I can display all of these, but what I can do is just read them anyway. So, SFS inverted. Georgia Tech's game plan. Run through an MF's face. Laughing emoji. Also, I don't get why Barstool Florida State was blaming jet lag when Georgia Tech was fine. I'll read you my exact tweet in response to that account because I responded to it. For Florida State to have the audacity to say, y'all ever have to throw footballs in a game while having jet lag after a plane ride around the world? Didn't think so. Go away. Go away. Go away. As I've already stated, running for 1.8 yards per rush outside of your 3 big plays, which outside of the one weren't even that explosive. They were just like what you should have if you have a decent offensive line. It was pathetic. They only ran for 98 rushing yards on a defense that allowed like 240 rushing yards last year. I don't get it. I don't. And DJ Uiagalelei, he is far from Florida State's biggest problem right now. I mean, DJ Uiagalelei performed better than all of Florida State's offensive linemen, all outside of maybe center Maurice Smith and the interior. But DJ played better than parts of the O-line, better than the receivers, better than the entire defensive line, better than the linebackers. And he did a better job, I think, than Mike Norvell and the staff did. I mean, he's not even their 4th or 3rd biggest problem right now. It's just it's incredibly asinine and also insanely arrogant to believe that jet lag, when Georgia Tech also suffered from jet lag, is the reason why you lost. It's what are we doing here? Like, at that point, just don't play in Ireland. Don't even play a road game outside of where your bus can take you. Gosh, it's just so, it's so toxic and excessive. Just stop. Amazing 768 LOL. And again, thank you SFS Inverted for the $5 super chat. Thank you for the $5 super chat. Amazing. Hello, Sam. That was a very entertaining game to watch. So glad college football is back and the chaos has already begun. Hashtag go chaos. Thank you for your first super chat on this channel. Amazing is someone who, for years, he's been a part of this channel for years now, has always said hashtag go chaos at the end of his comments. This man loves chaos. That's what he cheers for. Chaos is his number one rooting interest. If I remember correctly, I'm pretty confident he's a Michigan fan, but like that's his almost second rooting interest. He just loves chaos. And I'm happy that you got to see chaos. I honestly, despite the fact that I knew it would make me look somewhat like an idiot for having Florida State at 13-0, I was cheering for Tech. I like Brent Key. I love great offensive lines, and Georgia Tech had one entering this year. They could have one of the nation's best, if not the best, this season. And they deserved to win. And that was, I almost tweeted that at halftime. I'm like, the way Georgia Tech is playing, they deserve to win unless something drastically changes from Florida State. So thank you for the $5 super chat. J Willie 75, thank you for the $2 super chat. My Buckeyes are built exactly like the team up north last year. I disagree with that a little bit, but they have the potential to be built like Michigan last year, and that's all that matters at this point because they haven't taken the field yet, and we don't know. They have that type of potential. I'll agree with you, minus the fact that I think that J.J. McCarthy has a higher ceiling and is just a better QB overall than Will Howard could ever be. But you balance that out with the fact that Michigan's wide receivers from last year are not going to be as good as Ohio State's receivers from this year. But since we can, let's put you up on the screen here because we can do that now. Sorry again, just the chat when it's this busy, I can't get to all the super chats and put up on the screen. But when I can, I will do so. My Buckeyes are built exactly like the team up north last year. Also, Michigan. Let's compare and contrast. Secondary, probably better, if not the same, for Ohio State compared to Michigan last year, but again, very similar. Linebacker has the potential to be as good as Michigan's last year, but I don't think it can be better. And I would say, just due to experience and depth, Michigan's linebacker core from last year will be better. Defensive line, close, but due to schematics and also the fact that, Chris Jenkins, Mason Graham, Kenneth Grant, Josiah Stewart, Derek Moore, Braden McGregor, Jalen Harrell, I'd say Michigan's was deeper and at a higher ceiling, but again, it's close. Ohio State should have a generational defense this year like they did last year and like Michigan did last year. Let's look at special teams. I think that's obviously Michigan. Wide receivers, obviously Ohio State. Tight end, obviously Michigan. The offensive line, I think Michigan's had a higher ceiling last year, and you saw that in the playoff when they were uber dominant. But in the regular season, they were just kind of great, good, in that range at times, near elite. Ohio State can totally perform at that level this year. I've been on record saying that I think this Ohio State O-line overall will be good, above average. It'll be better than last year's, but I don't think it will be this top 10 unit like some say. But they have that potential if they play to it. They can have an O-line similar to, perhaps slightly better than Michigan's last year in the regular season. Quarterback, Michigan. Running back, I'm going to have to go with Ohio State. Donovan Edwards had a down year last year. Corum was awesome, but Judkins is an elite power back like Corum, and I think is a player with a higher overall ceiling too than Corum. And Henderson is just a player who, when healthy, is probably the running back with the highest ceiling in the country. So that's a little bit of a roster breakdown. They are different teams. Ohio State, I still think, is more finesse, while Michigan was more tough last year. But Ohio State should be tough like they were last year, probably tougher given all they return. And they have a lot more finesse than Michigan did last year, just based off of the wide receivers they have and the depth they have there. But Michigan had a lot of finesse too last year with Roman Wilson and J.J. McCarthy and Loveland and A.J. Barner. So there is a point to be proven there in my mind. There is. But thank you, Jay Willie, for the $2 super chat. Very much appreciate it. William Herzog, thank you for the $2 super chat. Excited for a great season. Go Blue 11-1 season. That's exactly what I project as of now, is that Michigan goes 11-1 or 10-2. I think 9-3, while possible, is kind of an extreme. I don't think Michigan loses all three of their big games. I also don't think they win all three of their big games either. I don't. Controversially, I actually think it's more likely Michigan wins all three of their big games than loses all three, but that's like Michigan is a 1 or 2% chance of winning all their big games. If they do, they may just win it all. And like a 1% chance of going 9-3. The percentages, I think, are larger than that for both, but they're very close, and in aggregate, they're much, much smaller. They're dwarfed by Michigan's chances of going 10-2 or 11-1. I think Michigan will go 11-1, and the most likely loss will be either to Oregon or more likely Ohio State on the road, which is what I have it as right now. And you'll see that when I do my conference predictions and college football playoff predictions tomorrow. Speaking of which, I previously had Michigan going to the Natty, and all of you said, not all of you, but many said, Michigan bias. And to the ones who said agree to disagree, I respect that. To the ones who just called me a Michigan hack, I don't respect that. Due to Florida State losing, I no longer have Michigan in the Natty. So as I've said before, it's all due to matchups. And Michigan, with the trench play they have, has a non-negotiable that like only Georgia does, where with their elite trench play, they can match up with anyone outside of teams that have better trench play than them and beat them which is why I had Michigan going to the national title this year previously, but losing to Georgia. That's changed due to the fact of certain seeding things and Florida State losing to, more teams than just Georgia Tech because they did not look good. But I think Michigan goes 11-1 in the regular season. We'll see how they look against Fresno State and against Texas, which will be their first test of the season. And wow, I'm very lucky to get the support that I get. SFS Inverted with another $5 super chat. I agree with Mays. Go Chaos. I hope upsets occur every game that doesn't involve my Buckeyes. It's the same thing with my Wolverines, and I don't want too much chaos. I don't want too much because I don't want to see like every team go 10-2 or 9-3. Like that, in my mind, that would kind of be boring. Like you want at least one team, like regular season. It'd be fun if the national champion had 2 or 3 losses, but you want at least to end the regular season, you want at least one control, like what Ohio State was in 2007 when everyone had 2 losses and they had 1 loss. You kind of want that because it does give some type of an anchor and some type of security. Maybe that's just me, though. I get the angle that everyone wants chaos for every team. Not everyone, but some people. Everyone is a part of the chaos group wants that. But I'm hoping that like there are some Big Ten games, some SEC games, ACC, Big 12, but especially SEC and Big Ten, since those are the bigger conferences, and ACC too, because it'd just be fun, that end up suffering massive upsets like every week. That would be very entertaining. So go Chaos, as long as it doesn't affect certain teams, including my Michigan Wolverines. But I'll deliver objective analysis regardless of what happens to those certain teams. And Wolvergeek, thank you for the $5 super chat and for your first on this channel. I really appreciate it. Florida State lost because they were soft on the lines of scrimmage. Bingo. They couldn't run or throw the ball. The play calling was very questionable. And I will add, they couldn't stop the run to save their lives either. Whether it was Haynes King, whether it was Jamal Haynes, whether it was their backup running back who was a walk-on in, let me just find his name because I want to know his name, in Chad Alexander, whether they used occasional motion and end-arounds with Malik Rutherford or with Eric Singleton Jr., whether it was Zach Pyron with the 1-yard touchdown run. Like, they all had good games. Georgia Tech's players did. And Florida State could not stop anything on the ground. That is the concern to me. The number one concern is the defensive line. Because I think the offensive line did a good job yesterday. It was just the play calling where Florida State was trying to run on the outside constantly, which with safeties coming down and linebackers and the fact that Florida State's wide receivers struggled to block, that didn't help. I think more outside runs would have done, not outside, more inside runs would have done Florida State more justice, but they struggled even there. But I think that Florida State's offense, the weaknesses and foibles they had can be hidden if they choose to rely on DJ a little bit more, and as the offense continues to gel, I think that can be a better unit. What's concerning to me is the defense, because Florida State with the offense they have, because their defense does have a higher ceiling, let's be honest. They have more NFL talent and more proven college talent on the defense than the offense. Florida State, if their offense is like what it was yesterday, but their defense all of a sudden becomes a top 10 unit, they can beat Miami. They can for sure beat Clemson. That Notre Dame game looks very tough, but Notre Dame could also not play up to their potential. And at that point, that could maybe be winnable in a very close game if Florida State's defense were to be elite, which it has the potential to be. I don't think Florida State's offense has the potential to be elite. But let's inverse that. And Florida State's offense plays to their ceiling, their defense doesn't, then I wouldn't pick Florida State to beat Miami. I would certainly not pick them to beat Notre Dame in November. And honestly, if Florida State's D-line doesn't get better and their offense doesn't play to their ceiling, I wouldn't favor them over Clemson at home. I just wouldn't. This team, yesterday's game, made me go from picking Florida State to going like 13-0, 12-1, something like that, to going 9-3, 8-4. And part of that's because I thought Notre Dame and Miami were close to Florida State, but just that Florida State was better coached and also more like dynamic, especially more so than Notre Dame. Miami just better coached. But now, after that performance and what I think Miami and Notre Dame will be, those are likely losses now. And they were soft, like Wolver Geek said, on the lines of scrimmage. They couldn't run the ball. They could throw, but not consistently. Not enough for Georgia Tech to respect them. Yeah. That at the end of the day is really what happened in that game. So thank you all for the super chats. I very much appreciate them. Yeah, thank you all for coming on, and we had a really good show today. Really good show. And I think that is rather incredible. Okay, like the video, subscribe to the channel, click the notification bell, share it around, and I mean, I guess you could say comment when this video is done, when the live show is done in a few seconds, few minutes, because then the comment section will be active and it won't just be the live chat. So your name will be in the comment section. I appreciate all of your guys' support very much. If you have anything else to say it in the chat. Also, for those of you who are my subscribers, I want to deliver this at the end. I am about to release a Discord, a College Football with Sam Discord, which I know some of you have requested. If any of you are interested in being moderators for said Discord, and moderators for my channel as well on YouTube for like the live show and stuff, email me here. And what I'll do as well is probably make a community post in the next few days about this and invite people to apply for moderator positions there. That way we can have like a great environment on the Discord, on the YouTube channel, and just really foster an even deeper community. Another thing, there are other surprises too that'll be coming, not just with the live show that I've scheduled and the graphics and other consistent content that you'll see, but there will be things too that you will want to partake in. So tomorrow, the agenda is adjusted college football playoff predictions and projections, though Georgia is still going to win it all. I'm telling you that right now. We also will have final conference predictions, and there may be a few more reaction stuff or maybe a special topic, but I know for sure after those two things, there will be preview and prediction videos. The first of the season for the Big Ten, because we got Penn State and West Virginia and some other schools to talk about as well. So email me at collegefootballwithsam@gmail.com, spelled exactly as you would spell that if you want to apply for a moderator position on my future Discord and also for my YouTube channel. Thank you all very much for watching this show. I appreciate the support very much, and we will be back tomorrow at 8 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, and also on Tuesday and Wednesday on that same time. Thank you guys very much, and I will see you all around. Oh, one more. We got one more super chat that just came in, so I can't do that. I can't quit just yet. Justin Ziegler, $5 super chat. Do you think NC State can make a run for the ACC? They play a different kind of physical football defensively that after yesterday might work. Let's see. I would say yes. I am actually in agreement with Armand on this, who's also been a loyal member of this show, and I've very much enjoyed his presence. NC State, I would say yes. And the reason I say that is because their schedule is workable. But more importantly, Grayson McCall is a productive quarterback. Robert Anai is a very good offensive coordinator. I mean, he looked Dino Babers look competent in 2022. Jordan Waters is a great running back, transferred in from Duke. He'll do well. The biggest question for NC State's their offensive line. If their offensive line is like it has been in the past, where it's mediocre or just above average or even bad, then I would say they could maybe make it to the championship game, but win it? No, they probably wouldn't even beat Clemson if that's the case. But they have Kevin Concepcion at wide receiver. They brought in Justin Jolly, a great tight end, who had over 500 receiving yards at UConn last year. Davin Van at defensive end's a good player there. More importantly, at safety and also corner, they have players like Devin Boykin, DK Kaufman, Aiden White, and we can go on and on. Their defense, you're correct, plays a very physical brand of football. That 3-3-5 and Dave Doran being a tough head coach, and I was going to say meathead, and I'll just say meathead, not in a negative way, but in like a good way. Like toughness. They preach toughness at NC State. I think they can make a run for the SEC and absolutely contend. Thank you for adding that on, Justin Ziegler, and for the $5 super chat. And you're all good because we're going to end the show off here now unless anyone else has a last-minute $5 super chat. And to answer your question, Daniel Wang, how far do you think Michigan goes in the playoffs with this Florida State loss? It all depends. I actually think that depending on other factors like what Notre Dame and Miami do with the Florida State game and what even Clemson does, it can actually be a detriment to Michigan. It very well can be, depending on what things ultimately happen. So thank you all so much for watching, and I will see you guys very soon. Bye-bye.